Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you all with us. The man who fell from the sky. It's 1970. A sniper's bullet kills a contractor on Cape Cod. A young reporter, whose name is David Gomes, gets the story. The backdrop to the story includes the war against the Black Panther Party throughout New England, the underground for draftees resisting the war in Vietnam, and the veterans returning home from that war. It engulfs the Cape Verdean community, which is the most populous African immigrant community in the country. And it involves a mystery that spans decades, 3 wars, and is defined by the depth of racism in New England, in America, and around the world, and by the madness of people struggling to define their own racial identity. Like all good mysteries, the end is not what you expect, but getting there is a page-turning tale. Its subtext, wrapping together radical politics, race, love, and war, and it will make you wrestle with the question of the morality of revenge. Yes, the morality of revenge in the quest for justice and the struggle against injustice. All through characters drawing us deeply into their story. The Man Who Fell from the Sky is the first mystery written by Bill Fletcher. We hope it won't be his last. Bill is better known as a union activist, scholar, and fighter for racial justice, and books like Their Bankruptness and Solidarity Divided. He's also the former president of Trans-Africa Forum and a proud member of the National Writers Union, UA Local 1981. And now, the next Walter Mosley, Bill Fletcher Jr. And welcome, Bill Fletcher. Good to have you with us back here at the Real News. Glad you could make it all the way up here from D.C.
I'm glad to be back. Absolutely. Thank you.
Good to see you. It's better than doing them by phone or Skype. This is a much better way of doing this.
Absolutely. I love it.
So, the first question obviously has to be, here you have all these years as a labor union activist, organizer, scholar, written books, talking about change in America, and you write a mystery novel.
Yeah.
So,
well, so the thing is, Mark, all of us have stories.
Yeah.
And I have a story. In fact, I have a lot of stories. And I started thinking about stories when I was a kid, but about 10 years ago, I decided to take a crack at writing a murder mystery, not this. And I went to an agent that I'd been introduced to. And so she said she would read it. And about 3 weeks later, she got back to me and she said she didn't like it. And she said, when you go back to writing nonfiction, come and see me.
how deflating though at the moment, right?
It was horrible.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. It was an interesting experience as someone who does a lot of teaching about how you can crush somebody with the words. And had I not enjoyed writing it, I would have been absolutely crushed. So I put that aside, but then I had this idea, and it was an idea based on an incident that took place in World War II that I'd read about a long time ago. And the idea started to grow. And I started thinking about how to use that incident in some ways as a jumping off point to a bigger tale. And I said, I've got to do it. But what actually moved me off the dime was I was with my daughter and my wife. And I told them about this story.
By the way, congratulations on becoming a grandfather.
Thank you. I am
I'm
very
sorry.
happy.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I
That's
really,
good.
thank you.
Yeah.
So I was with my daughter and my wife, and my daughter was sitting in this restaurant. My daughter's like looking down, and she says, Dad, you have a story there, and maybe more than one story. You need to write this. And that was what I needed. And it took me about 5 years to come up with the story and about 3 to 4 months to write it.
5 years to come up with the story. Is this 5 years of mulling it and playing it in your head, and 5 years of writing little pieces?
No, it was all in my head.
Uh-huh.
And it was sort of like, think about it as if you're creating a film. And that's what was going on in my head. I envisioned every scene.
Yes, yes.
I was envisioning characters. And I probably could have started writing earlier had my daughter said earlier, you got to write it.
Good for our children. Yeah. It's funny because I told you before you came in here today that on the way down here to the studio, I was thinking about your novel, your mystery novel, but what was in my head was I was going, what was that movie I just saw? What was the name of that damn movie? Wait a minute, it's Bill Fletcher's novel. So it is, because that is how you feel. You feel like you're watching.
That's what I wanted.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted. I wanted the reader to basically feel like they're watching a film. And I didn't set out to win any kind of Pulitzer or anything else, right? I set out to use fiction in the way that the people that I look at as iconic leaders, Dashiell Hammett, Octavia Butler, Kim Stanley Robinson, Walter Mosley, how they use fiction to move frequently very complex political issues, critiques of the system. And I wanted to do that. I particularly wanted to look at issues of race, justice, and revenge. And so I situated the story within the Cape Verdean American population, which is a population that a lot of people don't even know exists.
Right.
And so that's what I did. And I've been getting great responses.
So it's interesting that there's so many places to take this conversation in the time that we have together, but I mean, this is a mystery. It's a murder mystery.
Yes.
A young man who is Cape Verdean, who is a reporter, is trying to figure out what happened in this
Right.
death of this contractor
Right.
on Cape Cod, and this gets complex and unravels in there. But the question is, so let's talk about the Cape Verdeans.
Yes.
And why you chose to set it in this community, and who this community is of Africans who were whalers and fishermen who ended up on the shores of the United States,
Right.
Not as slaves,
That's right.
right? Not enslaved. So-
Exactly.
right?
They are the first post-1492 African population to come here voluntarily.
That's a really interesting way to put that. Right.
And it's really,
Right.
it's really important because that summarizes so much. What did they come as? They came as subjects of the Portuguese Empire. They came voluntarily as whalers and fishermen in the beginning. And then because the Cape Verde archipelago is subject to droughts, periodic droughts, there are these migrations off of the islands. And people started coming, following family members. They were Portuguese speaking or Criollo speaking. They were mainly Catholics. And what you said before is critical. They did not come as slaves. So you have this African population that arrives on the shores of New England.
And many of them racially mixed.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, that's just
all
piece, right?
spectrums of the rainbow.
Right.
From very light skin to jet black. And they come to New England and they encounter this other African population who were either the descendants of slaves or descendants of indentured servants. And then other African populations that come up from the Caribbean who were the descendants of slaves.
Right.
And so there's this whole identity issue about, well, what are they? And I'll give you an example of something that really struck me, Mark. Back around 1984 in the Jackson campaign, Jesse Jackson, when he was first running for president, I was one of the labor coordinators in New England. And I found out, I was told that there was this black longshore local in New Bedford. I said, wow.
New Bedford, Mass.
New Bedford, Massachusetts.
Right.
I said, wow, right? So I tried to see whether we could get them to back Jackson. I don't remember whether they did. But later I started writing a book with my cousin on the contribution of black workers in the formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations in the 1930s and 40s. And so I figured, well, let me go talk to the veterans of that period from the 30s and 40s, even though it was an AFL union. So the business manager of the union sets up a meeting for me with these veterans. And so I go into the meeting, and these very dignified Cape Verdean workers come in, almost all of them in suits. They're all retired by this point. So we sit down and I start asking them questions about their experiences on the docks. So at a certain point, Mark, I said, did you have any problem with the white guys? They look at each other. No. I said, you had no problem with the white guys? No. And I'm completely perplexed. And then one of them says, there was some trouble with the Greenwood boys, but that was it. But they never explained what that was. About a year later, I met an iconic figure in the New Bedford community named Jack Custodio, a Cape Verdean leftist, older. And I told him the story, and he broke out laughing. And he said, Bill, the Greenwood boys, they were the Portuguese. They didn't want to tell you, they did not want to admit they themselves were not Portuguese, they themselves were not white. They were trying to do everything that they could to avoid that question. That stuck in my head, and it very much influenced this book.
Yeah, and that to me, besides the mystery, which I guess we can't, I don't know how much we can talk about the mystery.
We can talk some of it.
Without giving away, which we don't want to do. But part of the story has to do with the complexity of race in our society.
That's right.
White relationships with black people, black folks' relationship with white people, Cape Verdeans struggling with their own identity. Am I Portuguese? Am I African? Don't call me black. I am black.
Oh yeah.
And all those pieces that fit together, there's some vile, openly vile racist behavior and subtle racist behavior.
That's right.
And people try not to even think about race. And interactions between black and white people that are just the normal, everyday interactions we all have that aren't about race and racism, about two people together, for whatever reason they're together. So that's...
Oh yeah.
You really kind of are able to make this subtext, this tapestry of complexity, and just throw it in there.
There's a scene that I can acknowledge here, because it doesn't give away the rest of the story. That takes place, as you may remember, there's a family gathering on Labor Day weekend.
Yes.
And I created that scene to bring out a number of these contradictions. And what happens, in brief for your viewers, is that there's an argument between two relatives that one of them is...
They're all Cape Verdeans.
They're all Cape Verdeans.
Right.
But one of them is very pro-national liberation struggle in Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau. That's going on right then. There's a war going on to free Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde Islands from the Portuguese. And this one particular relative is really very pro that. But then there's another relative on the other side of the family who continues to insist that he's Portuguese. And it comes almost to blows, right? And I created that because that is what happened. That tore apart different families. This whole issue of what are you? There were people that I met when I was a kid going to Cape Cod, and they were black. They had different names that I was used to growing up in New York, and they identified as Portuguese. And as I was saying to you before the show, even as a kid, I followed geography, right? I knew something about where Portugal was, and I knew they didn't look like anything out of Europe. And so what was that about? And when I was trying to talk with my parents about it, I got very partial responses and answers. But what you see is this challenge, this struggle that's going on in a population to redefine themselves. And they ultimately redefine themselves through a combination of the national liberation struggle going on in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, and the Black freedom movement in the United States. And these two movements help to transform the consciousness of this people.
So you also have these characters in here. It's interesting. One of the things that struck me about most of the characters, the main characters that we get into, there's a number of them, are veterans.
Yes.
Of World War II.
That's right.
Of Korea, Vietnam.
That's right.
Which is interesting that you chose to do that.
Yeah.
Even the investigative reporter, Gomes, is a Vietnam vet, along with the
Yeah, he had served on the DMZ in Korea. Right. Veterans are very important to me. I learned history through studying wars, and like many kids, glamorized war.
Yeah, right.
And then came Vietnam, and my I could have been drafted if I was a year older, but I did not. And I wasn't planning on going. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I wasn't planning on going.
I remember very well.
Yes, I'm sure you did.
I was drafted in '67, so I remember very well.
Right, well, it faced us. But I started to, after the war ended, I started talking to veterans, Vietnam veterans, and reading more about their experiences, and particularly how veterans generally are treated when they come back from wars, even the so-called greatest generation, the veterans of World War II, and the conditions that they returned to, it always struck me. The stories that veterans will tell and won't tell. I had an uncle who was in World War II. I had actually two great uncles. One of them was in a black military unit in Italy, and the other, we're not sure what he was in, but he was in France. And a couple of times I talked to him about World War II, and he mentioned the Battle of Saint-Lô, which is spelled S-T and then L-O. And he would, anytime he mentioned Saint-Lô, he would lower his head and he'd say, I never saw anything like it. And he wouldn't talk anymore about it.
Yeah.
I read about the Battle of Saint-Lô and then I understood. And so part of me is always wants to appreciate the courage of veterans and the challenges that they face coming back.
Coming back, right.
You know, like in the story, there's this security guard in this building in New Haven.
Right, right. The
Who
black man
served
outside
in
the
Korea,
restaurant. Right.
And I constructed him as someone who had a lot of dignity,
Yep.
but had been consistently disrespected. And this is someone who put their life on the line in the Korean War, comes back and is treated like garbage. And I wanted to introduce that into this.
So, I mean, one of the things that's not easy to do often, especially for somebody who's not a fiction writer, is to find characters that you can develop, even on a minor level, that you can be empathetic with, that are real. Even the people that I didn't like in your novel were real. I mean, I knew all these people at some point.
Exactly, that sums it up. That's how I had to do it. One of the most evil of the characters in the book was a composite of certain people that I have known. And I did not create him as a caricature, but he is a composite. The security person that I mentioned was also someone that I knew. And one of the things that's critical in writing fiction, is not to fall into caricatures.
Right, which is easy to do.
Very easy to do. And it's also, you're always running a risk that I've learned about how much detail you go into. There's a detail that you can see in your head, in your third eye, right? That sometimes doesn't translate onto the paper. And sometimes you have to force it there, but you also have to guard against putting too much in there. And there's different philosophical views on this. My publisher was someone that was very much into get in and get out, as opposed to take someone like the late Stieg Larsson, who wrote The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo.
Yeah.
Who I love, right? A lot of detail, a lot of background, right? And there's these different philosophies.
And you kind of have a bit of both.
Yes. Yes.
In this.
Absolutely.
Right?
I'm much more influenced by Stieg Larsson, but I'm learning from my publisher.
Right.
And he basically, it's so funny. I really learned a lot from, his name is Tim Sheridan, the head of Hardball Press. Learned an immense amount about writing fiction. Because when you write nonfiction, it's just totally different. And editing is completely different, Mark. there was a whole subplot that
Really?
in the first, in the first draft, and Tim said, you got to either get rid of that or you got to provide more detail. But the manuscript is too long. So basically, you got to cut this, right? And the thing about cutting fiction is that it's sort of like surgery. Because you have to remove all reference to something. It means you have to go back very carefully.
You can't leave something in a book earlier in the night, and then all of a sudden it disappears.
Oh yeah.
Right. What happened?
Because I've seen people who didn't have a good editor,
Right.
and it's like all of a sudden we're like, where did that come from, right? Or where did it disappear to?
So, one thing this is not really as an aside, but I was thinking about how I'm glad that you, given the world we're in at this moment, where America is really confused about who the good guys are and who the bad guys are and where we all fit, at least the FBI in your book did not come off as the guys in shining armor
No.
that are here to protect us all. I appreciate you.
No, absolutely. It's not going to happen. Not with me. I mean, I think I can say for the viewers that one of the things I tried to do was to make things a bit confusing. Not confusing in the sense of, wow, like what's going on, but confusing in the sense that it's not always apparent who is creating the most trouble for the main character.
Right.
Right. And one of the things I wanted to introduce was to, in a funny way, popularize the role that the FBI played at that time in history in being incredibly repressive and disruptive. So,
There were.
right? And exactly. So in this case, rather than concentrating on finding this killer, they're more interested in trying to link the main character with different political organizations.
Black Panthers, other revolutionary groups.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And that is what, in fact, was happening.
So one of the difficult things to do in a book like yours, and books like this, is taking the political world that we find ourselves in the early 70s, late 60s in the United States, and weaving that through a story without it becoming the story.
Right.
But without it, it just becomes another mystery novel that you don't, that has no political social context.
Yes.
That's it. But you did it. I must say, I'm not just saying this because you're saying. Listen, if I didn't like the book, we wouldn't be talking about it. So
Thank you.
But
it was very hard. It was very hard.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad you raised that because I just finished reading a manuscript from someone else that is very good in a lot of ways, but his central story gets completely lost in all of the background that he created.
Right. Which is easy to do.
It is really easy to do. But the other thing is just as easy, of not putting things in. So, for example, every so often introducing a particular song or highlighting the fact that everybody liked Dodge Daytonas, from 1967, 1968. Or the death of Jimi Hendrix, right? So there was different things that I tried to insert in there to give the reader a flavor of what was going on. Now, some people have said to me that they wanted more. And,
But the danger with more is you lose the mystery novel and it becomes a polemic. That's the danger of too much.
Or just a history book.
Right.
Yeah, right. No, exactly.
So the mystery itself, I mean, I wasn't sure. I knew it was a good mystery, as I was telling Valerie as I was reading it the other day and really getting into it, and because A, it held my attention, but B, I wasn't sure how it was going to end. And if you can't guess the ending, then you found a writer who knows how to write a mystery.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's interesting you raise that because I had this discussion with a relative who was in some ways, he liked the book, but he wanted more much more of a whodunit. And I said, I'm more interested in motivation.
I want to get to this, exactly. So let's talk about this motivation.
Sure.
One of the things the murders that take place in this book, and you're trying to figure out who did the murder, and there's one person you think could be the person.
Right.
And that story is all wrapped up in how you identify in race, and how families identify in race, and who this person was, and vile races fall into this as well. They become part of the story, and it gets very confusing who's the good guy, who's the bad guy sometimes, and that's which I liked. But one of the things about the characters who developed and how you did this, I'm really curious about, is your own struggles here around the question of justice, injustice, how revenge takes part in this.
Right.
And it's not morally ambivalent, but it wrestles with deep moral questions here, without giving us an answer.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Right?
No, you're right. You're right.
I mean, so when is revenge right? When is it right to go after somebody who committed this horrendous racial crime?
Right. That's what I was trying to grapple with. And
how long do they have to pay? Should we kill them? Should we not kill them?
well, one of the things that I was really getting at in this is the issue of the acknowledgement of wrong.
Right.
And that in this country, I mean, everyone's been talking about George H.W. Bush and, in the light of his death and his legacy. One part of his legacy that I will not forget is that he said, I'm not going to apologize for anything the United States does, even when it's wrong. And I thought that is the quote that we should use when we transform the United States. We should remind everybody that this was the thinking that led us from one disaster, one atrocity into another. And so I was looking at this question, right, of can someone commit a major crime and then go on with the rest of their life and be exemplary,
Right.
but owe nothing? And how do you judge that? And that's really what I wanted to get at with
That's the central moral question of the book.
Yes,
Wrapped around a murder mystery.
that's right.
A deep murder mystery.
That's right. Yeah.
Plus, you also had some beautiful touches of love relationships, and the complexities of those are in here too. It's not easy in 300-odd pages to kind of get all this complexity of human relationships, man and woman, and all the rest coming together in this way. But you chose to do that as well.
I did because one of the things I wanted to do is the main character is in his 20s, sort of late 20s, but I wanted the reader to appreciate the challenges that a young man in his 20s in 1970 is going to be facing, the ambiguities and ambivalences. This is a guy who is in love, but he doesn't know at the end of the day, should I go forward? Is this going to constrain me? Is this going to constrain
familiar.
her? Right. Exactly. I think that there's quite a number of us that face that, right? And so I wanted that to be real.
Right.
I felt like this is a real dilemma.
Well, you painted a complex picture, racially, economically, working class. These are close stories of working class people, Italian cop, Black Cape Verdean writer, love affairs, several wars, train killers. Who did it? We don't know. We're going to find out. But to find out, you got to read The Man Who Fell from the Sky. And you really did a great job in this book.
Thank you so
much.
much.
Really did.
Thank you very, very much.
First-time mystery from a great writer, and I recommend it, The Man Who Fell from the Sky. And great to have you back at The Real News. Good to see you, my friend.
Real pleasure. Thanks so much.
Get the book. And I'm Mark Steiner here for The Real News Network. We'll talk together really soon. Take care.